Today I am going to show you how to make one quilt block and then show you 3 different projects you can make with it. Sewing quilt blocks can be easier than you think. I love small quilted projects because you can decorate your whole life with them. In this video I'm featuring the classic Churn dash block. This is such a classic, beautiful block, and it's actually super simple to make. You are going to die when you see these projects. We are making a Ninja Creami cozy, a sweatshirt with an applique, and notebook covers. This video also has chapters. So let's dive in and see what we can make. Let's get started with a Churn dash block. Print out this handy cheat sheet from the link in the description below. This has 4 sizes of Churn dash block measurements. We're going to do the 6-inch block for this first project. So this chart shows us exactly how big to cut each piece of fabric. Start with a middle square measuring 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches. And then for the 2 other fabrics, we're going to need a square 4.25 by 4.25 inches. And then also strips 11 inches by 1.5 inches. First, grab your 2 squares. These are going to be the half square triangles in our project, and we're going to do a 4 at a time method. So these 2 larger squares will make us all 4 half square triangles that we need. So pin these together and then sew around the edges all the way around 1/4 inch from the edges. So go ahead and sew these edges, pivoting at each corner, and we're sewing all around the entire square. We're not leaving an opening. We're going to end up cutting this open, so we don't need an opening to turn it. Once you have that done, take it to your cutting mat. We're going to cut the square diagonally twice from corner to corner. So these are diagonal cuts, and if you can keep that square flat on your mat, that'll help you. And then when you open these up, you'll have 4 different pieces, and they will open up to be half square triangles. Open them up, and we are going to press the seam allowance toward the darker fabric. So place the lighter fabric on the board and then press across to get your seam allowance where the darker fabric is. Now we have 4 half square triangles, but we're just going to trim them up a little bit. So we want them to be the same size as the middle block, or the finished unit size will be what we use to measure. So this will be a 2.5 inch square. So each unit in our Churn dash block is 2.5 inches for the 6-inch finished block. So I'm just going to use my cutie cuts to trim it down. You can also just trace the 2.5 inch middle square if you want. You definitely don't want to skip this step because we want our block to be nice and squared up. Once you have your half square triangles, we are going to set those aside with the middle block, and then we just have to do the rail fence block. Now the last element of this block is the rail fence block, which are these striped blocks just with 2 colors. So we need 4 of these, and the 2 strips will make all 4. So we're going to sew these together with the right sides together using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After you've done that, we're going to press this open. Again, press towards the darker fabric if you have a darker fabric. Now we're going to cut the strip down into 4 squares measuring 2.5 by 2.5 inches for the 6-inch block that we're doing. So cut the strip down into segments 2.5 inches wide, and you might also need to trim the top and bottom if it is a little longer than 2.5 inches. So this strip is designed to be a little bit too long, so you should be fine getting 4 blocks out of this. And once they are all trimmed up, we'll move on to the next step. Now we're going to lay all of our blocks out in the Churn dash pattern, and then we're going to sew these together in strips. So we're going to sew the top 3 into a strip, and then the middle 3, and then the bottom row together. Now we're going to flip all 3 rows over and press the seam allowances. So we're going to press the top and bottom row seam allowances that we just sewed into the center. And then for the middle row, press those 2 seam allowances out. And by doing this, we'll be able to interlock our seams and get better points. So now we're going to sew these 3 rows together, right sides together. And when you pick those up, your seam allowances should be able to butt up against each other, and that way you'll get that sharp point at the square. I like to use a few pins to do that too. And once you have got all 3 of those in, your Churn dash block is done, and we're ready to use it in a project. Next up, I'm going to show you how to make a composition notebook cover. These hold a standard composition notebook and just make it so pretty and fun. Now go ahead and download this free pattern for the notebook cover. It's available in the link in the description below. Trim along the dashed edges and tape these together, and then you can cut out your pattern pieces. First, we're going to cut out 2 top bottom pieces and 2 side pieces. You can use the same fabrics for these or different. These are going to be the piecing that goes around the turn dash block for the front cover. Now we're going to cut out 1 lining, which is the entire piece of this fabric. This will go behind our notebook inside the cover right here. And then we're also going to need 1 main piece, which will go on the back cover. So to cut out the main piece, we're going to do that first. We're going to use this dashed line. So the main piece is smaller than the lining. So this is how we're going to cut 1 using that dashed line. Once you're done with that, you can set this aside for now, and then we're going to cut out a lining piece and 2 flat pieces on the fold. To cut 2 out on the fold at the same time, we can fold our fabric straight from the bolt. This has 2 layers, and then I folded it on top of itself so that I can create a fold on the side here. And once you have those 2 flat pieces, we can set them aside and we'll start assembling our notebook cover. And then I used this bright green for my lining. So we're going to set all those aside and start working on the front pieced panel. So grab your churn dash block and then grab all the little side pieces. We're going to start by sewing the 2 side pieces to the side of the churn dash block. And then after we sew those on, we'll sew the top and bottom to finish that front panel. After sewing the side pieces on, press those out. Now attach the top and bottom to finish this panel. And then press those out and press the whole panel pretty well. Now we're going to interface the front panel and also the back main piece that'll go on the back of the notebook cover. So I like to just stick my whole panel on top of the interfacing. After you interface, you'll also want to square up the front panel. Sometimes when you're piecing, it'll be a little bit off. So square that up and then interface the back main piece. Now we're ready to sew these together. So we're going to sew the main back piece just right on that front panel. Use a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and then we're going to press the seam allowance toward the back of the notebook. Now top stitch that seam allowance 1/8 inch from the seam to give it a nice finish. Now we're going to grab the flat pieces and interface both of them, and then fold them in half and press, and then top stitch about 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch from that fold. Repeat for both flaps. Now we're going to assemble the notebook cover. So we're almost done. Grab your front of the notebook cover and put it face up, and then put the flaps on the sides lined up with the corners. Now we're going to baste these in place 1/4 of an inch from the edges just to hold them. Now with those in place, we can stick our lining right on top of that and make a whole sandwich. We're going to line up the corners, pin them, and then sew this together with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. We're going to leave a little opening in the middle of the notebook cover to turn. And then once you're done sewing, we're going to trim the corners and turn it right side out. Now we're going to press really well and make sure where the opening is, you have pressed the seam allowance so that it matches up with the rest of the notebook cover. And then we're going to top stitch. You can either top stitch around the entire thing or just at the top there to cover that opening. This notebook cover fits very snugly, so if you do top stitch the entire thing, make sure you're not going too far over so that it fits. Now you're all done, and you can slip your composition book into your cover, and it is ready to go. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make the quilt block version of the Ninja Creami holder, and you can also make a plain version using the same instructions. Download the printable pattern on my website. There's a link below. The pattern will print on 2 pages, and it has pieces both for the pieced version of this cozy and also for the plain version. So the top and bottom and sides are for the pieced version. If you're using the plain version, you'll just use the lining to create the exterior of the holder. I'm going to start by showing you how to do the pieced version, and if you're doing a plain version, you can just skip ahead to where we start assembling the cozy. So you're going to need 3 3-inch quilt blocks, which are actually 3.5 inches before we trim. Then you'll need 2 top and bottom pieces and then 4 middle side pieces. We're going to start by sewing the quilt blocks together with these spacers in between and on the sides. You're going to want to make sure your quilt blocks are squared up before you sew these together. Use a 1/4 inch seam allowance to sew them together and then press well. Now we're going to sew the top and bottom pieces to the top and bottom of this panel. Press up and repeat on the bottom. This panel will be too big, and that's on purpose. Piecing can sometimes be tricky, so use your lining pattern piece to trim this down to the right size. Now your panel is done and we're ready to assemble our cozy. So at this point you're going to have your front panel and a lining piece from the same pattern piece, and then also a layer of batting. We are also going to need a base piece cut from batting, one from main and one from the lining. You want to interface the main base and the main panel. I accidentally interfaced the bottom of this base too, but that's okay. And then you're going to need 2 handle pieces. The handle is optional, and then interface one of those pieces. So we're going to start by sewing the handle pieces together, place them together, right sides together, and sew the sides 1/4 inch on each side, leaving the top and bottom open. And then we're going to turn this right side out. Press the handle well and then sew 1/8 inch on either side of the handle to give it a nice top stitch. Now we're going to use spray base to attach our main pieces to the batting pieces. The spray base will hold these layers together while we sew. When you're done spraying, let these dry a little bit so that the basting isn't tacky. Now if you want, you can add some quilting lines on your panel, especially if you're doing the plain panel. I like to do stripes or another quilting design. This is just top stitching. For this quilted one, I am going to just do lines around the quilt blocks to give it a little extra pop. Now we're going to do some stay stitching around both base pieces and along the bottom of the main pieces and the lining. This stay stitching is a regular length stitch about 3/8 inch from the edges. This will help us ease the rounded base into the main piece of the cozy. Stay stitching helps the fabric not stretch, and this is super important when you're sewing something like a cylinder like we're doing. Okay, now we're going to start assembling. So first we're going to take our main piece and our lining piece and match the short edges, and then sew with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. On the lining piece, leave an opening 1 to 2 inches long in the side. That way we can turn the cylinder with this opening instead of leaving an opening later. After you've sewn those, turn the exterior fabric right side out and open that seam allowance and press it down. Now we're going to pin and sew the handle right on top of that seam, centered over the seam. So we're going to pin on the top and the bottom and then stitch it on to hold it. You can use a base stitch for this since we'll sew it again later. Now we're going to sew the cylinder together, the base to the main. So the first step is to fold your cylinder base in half and mark the 2 points. We want to mark all 4 quadrants of this, so then fold it in half and match those 2 points and mark the other 2 quadrants. This will help us pin the 2 pieces together evenly. So we're going to do that again using the seam that we have and then the other side of the cylinder, and then match those 2 points and draw 2 more marks. So repeat this with the main pieces and the lining pieces. Now turn the main cylinder inside out and we're going to start pinning the base to it right sides together. Use lots of pins and match up those quadrants that you marked first, and then stretch the rest of the fabric to match. If you want to, you can start clipping into that cylinder piece just a little bit. You don't want to clip past about a 1/4 inch, but this can help your cylinder piece lay flat against the base as you pin. So just keep pinning, and then we're going to sew these together. Now we're going to maneuver this into our sewing machine. The easiest way for me is to put the base on the bottom and then carefully sew around the cylinder until you get back to where you started. And then we're going to clip the seam allowance just a little bit more and repeat with the lining pieces. Now we're going to leave the main inside out and turn the lining right side out, and then we're going to stick the lining into the main cylinder. With the right sides together, we're matching the top edges and pinning in place. Now we're going to sew these together 3/8 inch from the edges. If you can squeeze this over your sewing machine, this will be the best way to sew. We don't need to leave an opening because we have an opening in the lining. So now you can pull up your lining and find that opening and pull everything through that to turn it right side out. When you get everything pulled out, we're going to pin the opening closed and just top stitch along that opening really close to the edge just to close that up. And then we're going to stuff the lining into our main cozy. Then use your iron to press the top edges together, and then we're going to top stitch along the top about 1/8 of an inch from the top. That'll keep the lining in place. And then once you're done with that, your ice cream cozy is ready to use. This will keep your hands nice and warm when you're eating ice cream this winter. And finally, this is actually the quickest project. I'm going to show you how to make an applique sweatshirt with a quilt block on the front. This is so fun to wear to show off your quilty style with some cute patchwork. For this project, we're going to start with a 9-inch churn dash block. Each unit is 3.5 inches in this block. So follow the instructions to create your 9-inch block, which will be about 9.5 inches before we sew it into the project. So we'll need a sweatshirt, your quilt block, a light fabric to line the quilt block, and interfacing. Start by backing your quilt block with fusible interfacing. After you've done that, we're going to trim and square up our quilt block so it's a nice square. Now we need a piece of lining fabric to match the size of our quilt block. So you can either cut it 9.5 inches or use your quilt block as a pattern piece to cut this lining fabric. Now pin the lining to the quilt block with right sides together, and then we're going to sew 1/4 inch from the edges. We're going to sew all the way around this, not leaving an opening. Now we're going to trim the corners and taper the edges just a little bit so that we get a nice point on our quilt block. Now to turn this right side out, we're going to do something that's going to feel a little crazy, but don't worry. So pull up your lining and make a little slit into it. We need about 2 or 3 inches to turn this. And then we're going to use that opening to turn our whole block right side out. Use a chopstick or turning tool to get those points sharp, and then give this a really good press. Now we're going to sew our quilt block right onto the top of our sweatshirt. This is basically a big applique, so we're going to want to center it. I like to put it about 3 inches below the neckline, center it, and get it all situated, and then pin in place. Now we're going to squeeze this under our sewing machine. If you need to, lift up your presser foot to get the front of your sweatshirt into your sewing machine. And then we're going to use a regular 2.5mm stitch length to top stitch this onto our sweatshirt. We want this stitching to be about 1/8 of an inch from the edge. Clip your threads and then give the applique a final press. This applique method is super pretty and leaves a nice edge that won't fray. Thank you so much for watching. For more great sewing, click the video above.